Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Disrupting Mobility Summit. Please welcome Master of Ceremonies Greg Lindsay from New Cities Foundation.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. This is going to be a very exciting day and a half of disruption of all kinds, disruption of cities, disruption of mobility, the disruption of conference proceedings, if we get into some really good arguments here. It's my pleasure to be here. I can literally say I've been looking forward to this conference for more than a year after I last visited Ryan at the Media Lab last fall. And finally, that day is upon us. So just a few quick notes about how we're going to structure the day. We're going to begin with a few morning plenaries, and then after lunch, we're going to break into parallel sessions for a few more panels. And then late this afternoon, this evening, we're going to go downstairs for the poster session to sort of see the various posters on, I believe, sort of policy recommendations and sort of other research, followed by a reception and the announcement of the winners of the best papers and the hackathon winners. And then that'll be followed by cocktails and good conversation tonight before we re-adjourn in the morning for more panels and then adjourning right around lunch. So with that, I'd like to introduce the first of our four organizers. This conference is a sort of semi-unique sort of confluence of three educational institutions and the InnoZ research out of Berlin. So I'd like to thank, since we're going to be doing a lot of thanks in this first session, I'd like to thank Ryan for having me as the Master of Ceremonies. I'd like to thank Susan Shaheen from the University of Berkeley, University of Cal at Berkeley, for co-organizing this, along with Philipp Rode of LSC Cities and Florian Lennert of InnoZ. So first, sort of introduce the setting and welcome you. Ryan Chin, MIT, please.
Thanks. I am very happy to have you here. Very personally excited to engage you all on this topic of disruption and what it means not only for mobility, but also for society in general. I hope the next few days you'll be able to have some meaningful dialectic around this topic. I want to thank our co-organizers, especially Susan Shaheen. In fact, without her and her summit back in Berkeley, we would have never had this summit. We had a lot of discussion with her about how to take this topic about shared mobility and expand it to a much larger audience. And so therefore we thought, well, why don't we team up and bring it to MIT? Let's partner with LSC and InnoZ to bring sort of the global capital here to think about this topic. So I want to thank her very much for this. I also want to thank our speakers that are coming from far and wide to participate in this conference. I think that that's sort of a testament to the importance of this topic, and of course the audience for coming here as well. I think you'll have a wonderful next couple of days to talk about this area. I also want to thank the sponsors as well. Without the sponsors and partners, this would not be possible. We tried very hard to make this conference as accessible to as many people as possible. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to do it. And then finally, I want to welcome you to our home. This is my home. This is MIT Media Lab. I've been here for over 17 years. And I'm very happy to have you come and think of this place as your home for the next couple of days. We have not only tours on Friday of the Media Lab, but also the campus, as well as local companies. So I want you to really get a sense of what this place is all about through not only the session, but also to engage in our community. I also want to thank two people that are centrally responsible for this house that we're in. The first one is Nicholas Negroponte. He's our first speaker. He's the founder of the Media Lab, and without him, this building, this institute, this Media Laboratory wouldn't exist. So I want to thank him for that, and he'll be coming up to speak momentarily. The second is Bill Mitchell, my late advisor. He, along with Nicholas and a few other key people, were centrally responsible for getting this building built in the first place. Bill selected the architect, Mr. Fumiko Maki, to design this very elegant building. And this is a place that Bill would be delighted to be at, to see that everyone here descend upon the Media Lab to talk about disruption and and the impact of that on our world. He would be delighted to see that this topic of this, which very much relates to his last book, Reinventing the Automobile, is the central reinventing the automobile and reinventing our cities for the automobile and for transportation in general as being the central topic of this summit. He would be delighted to have you here. Thank you very much.
Susan, would you please join us next? Susan Shaheen.
Good morning. Thanks so much for joining us. And I want to acknowledge all of our collaborators from the academic institutions. We are so delighted to have all of you here. And we are going to have, I think, a wonderful session the next day and a half. And we definitely want to thank all of you for being here, all of our speakers, and all of our sponsors to start. So I get a little nostalgic because I've been in this space of shared mobility for about 2 decades. And so one of the things I always like to do is start with some photographs from the past. And so these are a number of my colleagues from North America. Early days starts. You can see me actually down in the right corner, starting off with my doctoral dissertation research. And this is another picture. Many of you have probably not seen this. This was what we call the birth of new mobility. And I did my doctoral work at UC Davis. And this was a meeting that we convened, and a close colleague of mine, Dan Sturgis, put this together. And actually, if you look at it carefully, you can see all of the different organizations that came together to discuss this back in 1998. So this topic has been with us for a very long time. And then fast forward to 2013, Ryan mentioned that we launched the first Shared Mobility Summit in San Francisco in 2013. And this was a slide, a collage that I put together to represent all of the companies and industries that were in that space at that time. And now, fast forward to 2015, we have a much larger ecosystem of services. I'm not going to go through this with you, but you can take a look at it. You can see that this space is alive and thriving and disrupting transportation today. And I think the goal of this meeting is to really focus on how to maximize the social and environmental benefits that will come from this ecosystem and from this disruption. And I'm just going to conclude with some quotes to start us off thinking about the future and what we want to accomplish here today. Kevin Kelly always comes to mind to me, one of the founders of Wired magazine. In 2009, he gave a very prophetic talk, and he is to be credited with the phrase, access trumps ownership. And he predicted that people would be moving more towards an access model away from an ownership model, and that our lives were going to really change, and that in 2009, we were really just getting started with this concept. And I think all of you feel that energy today. And then I think this is also a really important quote. This is one I like to use quite a bit by William Gibson. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. The future is already here, but it's not evenly distributed. So how can we bring this innovation and this disruption that we're talking about, not just to those of us in North America, but globally around the world today? And then finally, I'd like to conclude with this quote by Einstein: "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." So I want to just conclude my introductory comments today by saying let's reflect over the next 2 days on where we really truly want to go. And with that, I'd like to thank you for coming and looking forward to all of discussions with you in the next day and a half.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Florian Lennert from InnoZ in Berlin. And I'm very pleased that we were able to bring these institutions together. Ryan, we worked together going back on the city car project, and already we had EDIC and InnoZ and MIT collaborating on what was a really exciting project. And out of this grew a longer collaboration and this really exciting conference where I think it's not just about bringing the institutions together, it's about bringing the different perspectives together, a European perspective and a North American perspective, but also different perspectives on the issue of mobility. So yes, shared mobility, very important. But there are some other factors. The ultimate shared mobility, of course, is public transport, and we'll talk about it a little bit later in our session. If we really want to fix the world's transport problems, it's not just going to be shared mobility. We will also have to focus on innovative new public transport systems. And the other element that we want to highlight somewhat is that there's also an energy component here. So we can think about shared mobility, but as long as we don't substitute drivetrains, as long as we don't use renewable energy to propel ourselves, then shared mobility will not really make the final contribution to fixing some of these problems that we all know are quite urgent. So this is a theme that we also wanted to focus on, and I think the fact that we have social scientists, natural scientists, engineers, people who work in policy, people from industry coming together is really important to try and figure out how we can make progress on this, and then also how we can develop the business models and the policy strategies to get us there. So that's really all I wanted to say right now, and I'm very pleased to be here and look forward to having a wonderful 2 days with all of you. Philipp Rode will say a few more words to EDIC.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. It's really wonderful to be here this morning. On behalf of the London School of Economics, I want to welcome you. And my name is Philipp Rode. I'm the Executive Director of LSE Cities, which is one of about 20 research centers at the school, focusing, as the name suggests, on global urbanization and urban change. Internationally, we're probably best known for our Urban Age program, which we run in collaboration with Deutsche Bank's Alfred Hausen Society, also a partner at this conference today. What brings us to the table? Well, first and foremost, three wonderful colleagues and institutions that have asked us to join this event in preparing it, but also a strong belief and conviction that if we as urbanists don't understand technology, we're going to fail. And equally, I think, if technologists don't understand what cities are about and urban development, we're also going to have a problem. The transport issue is particularly important. In some ways, transport is the fundamental maker and breaker of human interaction in cities. It's not just one sector of urban policy making, it's the most important one. And then there's the politics of all of this. Cities are wonderful environments to really deal with the politics of our socio-demographic issues, a whole range of economic considerations and environmental ones. It's very much related to direct action on the ground, allows us to engage in policy debates in a much more tangible way. This afternoon, we're going to have two dedicated sessions on cities, and I look forward to sort of a more targeted, direct conversation, but I can already predict the theme of cities will be the elephant in the room, which we're not leaving as an elephant. We're going to tackle it head on, and I really look forward to an engaging conversation. Thank you all, and see you later this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Philipp. With that, I'm going to segue to our first plenary session of the morning, Disrupting Mobility. Before I bring on our first speaker, I just wanted to discuss some of the other general issues. I think Philipp brought it up very well, as well as Florian and Susan, about some of the really big picture trends that, of course, lurking behind this: carbon emissions, climate change, energy transformations, reinvestment in public transit, all these things. Of course, the reason why mobility has become, I think, arguably the hottest topic in cities in just the past couple of years relates to both, very local business-oriented trends and, of course, the large-scale megatrends, including, of course, global population growth, urbanization rates. This is the part where I mentioned that half the world's population lives in cities, and of course that figure will rise to 3/4 by 2050. And then, of course, also my favorite statistic on this by Sully Angel at NYU, that urban land cover will triple in size by 2050. So essentially, the mass horizontalization of the world's cities continues with attendant urbanization and transport challenges. Of course, carbon emissions and climate change, one of the big ones. According to the IPCC, if I recall my statistics correctly, transport comprises 23% of carbon emissions. Next month, we're going to see world leaders gather in Paris for COP21, humanity's really last-ditch effort to actually hammer out a true climate deal, assuming it's not already too late before catastrophic climate change sets in. The energy transformations that Florian referred to, the very stealth electrification of the world, the rise of renewables, it's happening very, very quickly and yet invisibly, at least in the United States, and also more apparent efforts like Germany's Energiewende and other efforts, raising the potential of electrifying fossil fuel, various forms of that, and the coordination capabilities that are then added as cars become software, essentially. Of course, the rise of shared mobility. In 2010, Uber was a small startup aiming to serve ballers, and now it is a $50 billion valued corporation, where we've seen already in just the past 6 months the emergence of essentially a global alliance of its arch rivals, GD Kuwaiti and Lyft and Ola and Grab Taxi, all aligning themselves to basically start pushing back in a seeming land grab to seize the sort of urban mobility market. And of course, Uber has not been quiet or hiding in its ambitions to basically provide global logistics services within cities and to replace public transit. And then, of course, we're seeing new entrants into this. I mean, for a long time, mobility when it comes to the average consumer has, of course, been the automakers. They are now actively worried about what Google and Apple, and by Apple I mean Faraday, their stalking horse, are going to attempt to do as they enter into the car market. We already see comments from like Dieter Zetsche of Daimler saying that we want to own the software, we want to own the interface with the customer. So you can tell that they're already worried about their own form of disruption. And then I think, to echo some of Philipp's comments, today is, of course, devoted to the theme of disrupting mobility, but I think it's also important that we talk about disruption in the sense of that many of these elements have served to disrupt public institutions, to disrupt the city itself, and they threaten to disrupt the sort of fundamental, arguably fundamental human right of accessibility within cities. When Henry Lefebvre talked about, the right to the city, fundamentally it was a right to mobility within it, the ability to actually traverse it and actually sort of interact with people in public space. And this is something that is arguably under siege with many of these new developments and their potential threats to undermine public transit. So with that, I'd like to introduce the first of our 4 speakers in our morning plenary. We're going to have them each speak in turn, and then we'll sit and have a short conversation. So with that, I'd like to introduce, it's my distinct privilege to honor our first speaker, Nicholas Negroponte. I don't know where he is.
Thank you. So you have been suitably welcomed, and I will take that little piece out of my talk and use the rest to not disappoint you in the area of being a little controversial at the end of my talk. I thought a lot about disruptions and have been part of them in my life quite regularly. And I'm very fond of telling people I've been to the future so many times, I kind of know what it looks like. And the reason I say that, I've been at MIT for 50 years, over 50 years. And the Media Lab celebrated its 30th 10 days ago, but in fact, it was really the 45th of the predecessor groups of the Media Lab. And over that period of time, I can't tell you how many times I said, in 10 years, this will happen. And then 10 years comes, and it either did or didn't. And then you say, well, in 10 years, this will happen. And then that 10 years comes. And so you've been through that cycle so many times. It's almost as if you're sort of blasé and accustomed to sort of saying where it will be and then being there and then saying that. It's perhaps one of the few advantages of age. One of the funny things about disruptions in general, and this is a totally unreadable slide. I'm not even suggesting you try to read it, though it sure is more readable on my screen than I ever saw it on my laptop. This was a project in 1965, and it was running at the computer center when I was a graduate student, just before joining the faculty. What you would do is you'd specify where you wanted a car and specified where you wanted to go to. 1965. And it would schedule the car to pick you up and take you. Okay, so we think Uber is some great new disrupting innovation. 1965. Now, what happened between 1965 and today is not just that somebody made a better car system that was finally called Uber. But you had GPS, which made it easier to locate. You had mobile phones. You had Google Maps. You had all these things that suddenly, it's like these graphs in time meet at a point, and boop, it happens. Those Uber people didn't have any better idea than anybody, but the timing was perfect, and they did it with great resolve, and they did it very well. So disruptions don't just happen at some moment because somebody invented fusion. They happen because of coincidences. And so this is another one. This is when we did the Aspen movie map almost 40 years ago, 35 years ago. And that was our truck on the left with the cameras on it that did all the streets and all the directions, and that's the Google car today. You can almost not see a difference. But when we did it 35 years ago, we were almost hauled up in front of a Senate hearing by Senator Proxmire for messing around with taxpayer dollars to do some screwy thing analogous to studying the sex life of pigs. We were actually nominated for the so-called Golden Fleece Award, which I wish we had gotten, would have been a badge of honor, for something that today we take for granted. So it's also the times, there are many things. So, oh, there it is. I guess I got it out of place in my deck, but it's not important. So I'm going to talk about 3 disruptions. One is of the kind you know and understand, and probably most of the day is about. The second, a little bit less obvious, and the third, perhaps the most controversial. controversial. My first is akin to the elevator. The elevator changed cities like no technology in our history. And by changed, I mean changed the physical form of cities. And yes, the fact that Manhattan had bedrock also then added to elevators and made Manhattan. But in general, what is today's elevator? And it's certainly some form of self-mobility. I don't do self-driving car because maybe it's a self-driving bicycle, maybe it's a self-driving shopping cart. There are many self things which will completely change the city. No parking garages, no parking spaces, use of only 10% the number of vehicles. It assumes the whole sharing, which I'll talk about in a moment. Big deal. So the self-driving car and its first cousins will do for cities what elevators did, in my opinion. Will completely change the physical form of cities and our enjoyment of them. The second, which is the one already alluded to, and I just mentioned it, is the whole sort of sharing economy. That's a very big deal. And the reason it's a big deal is because it too will change the form. I come from an era that sort of emblematic of wealth was how many houses you had. I grew up, my parents had 3 or 4 houses during my entire childhood. And their parents had 3 or 4 houses, and their parents' parents had 3. You had a city house, you had a country house, and then if you could afford it, you had a country house that you used in the winter and a skiing resort, and then you had a country house maybe on a Greek island that you used during the summer, and it was emblematic of wealth. And those houses were closed down, shuttered, not rented, not used when you weren't there. And then, of course, the amount of space, the amount of land. Well, one of the things that's going to change with the sharing is that suburbs will disappear. Who on earth would ever want to live in the suburbs? It's a mindless, silly thing to do, and was being done at the time the cities were on their way down. You move to the suburbs because we have in the United States the most stupid tax system to fund schools. We fund school with real estate taxes. Crazy. The Europeans in this room, probably some of you don't even know that. It is so crazy that one of the reasons people moved to the suburbs was to get better schools. Another was to get clean air. Another was to get safety because there started to be muggings and robberies. So you left the city. When I was young, everybody left the city. I actually happened to always live in a city, but that was, again, because if you could afford it, you would live in a city, but you moved out. Why do that today? Why on earth no self-respecting millennial will live in the suburbs, period, end of stories? And it's a very interesting change. Now the third, and I want to be conscious of my time, is to me the most important. It's the concept of civics. Now, please listen carefully. Don't necessarily agree, you won't. But I feel very strongly about this. I feel we have pissed on civic society for 3 or 4 decades. We never recommend to our children to become civil servants. We say, be entrepreneurs. Go and work, forbid, for a hedge fund. But do we say, join the civil service? No, we don't. Because only idiots do that. The losers join the civil service. It's a crazy, crazy situation. And we have, even worse, this blind belief that capitalism is a form of democracy and is democracy. And to be, in some sense, socialist or interested in democracy where everybody rises versus dog eat dog is un-American. It's not only un-Republican, by the way, it's totally un-Republican, but it's un-American, which is really crazy. Democracy is not capitalism. And the big point is normal market forces hurt cities, hurt them badly. And the next time you tell somebody, let's give it to the private sector because they'll figure it out, think twice. Normal market forces screw cities. And if you don't believe it, go right to our own seaport here. It's a mess. It's a total mess because somebody said, oh, well, we'll let this corporation do that and this. No planning. Planning has fallen out of favor because it's considered undemocratic to have zoning laws where you do things. Well, folks, time to change that. And guess one other thing? Let's raise taxes. Taxes, what is this stuff about taxes? We're constantly, as if taxes were an ill. That's how societies actually can get things done. And if you want to look at these lists, I don't believe enormously in them, the 10 happiest countries, the 10 richest countries, the 10 most competitive countries, the 10 this, you look at the lists. And I guarantee you 8 out of 10 on the top of the list, and certainly the top 5, are socialist countries. And you say, wow, well, I don't really want to live in Norway or Sweden or Denmark or the ones who are always at the top. And it's for a very simple reason. And I'll use education as an example. The worst thing that's happened to public education in the United States is private education. The best education in the world is in Finland. Well-known, studied, measured, compared to other countries. They're outliers. Not one single private school. So when you have a private school, you're taking it out of the system. You pay double because you pay it in your taxes and you pay the private school, but it's like having your own bodyguards. So of course you don't care about the police. So there's a whole social structure and we have to redefine what it means. It's not communism, it means everybody thinking about everybody else. And that's the biggest disruptor of all because the kids are starting to believe that and understand that, and it will really change cities. I think that's my last slide, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was not what I was expecting you would say. That was... I now wish I lived in an alternate world where you're still writing a column for Finnish Wired. But thank you so much. Our next speaker is actually formerly in government, who was a public servant for us, Dan Doctoroff, the former deputy mayor under the Michael Bloomberg administration, former head of Bloomberg LP, and now running Sidewalk Labs, the urban arm of Google. Dan, please.
Thank you so much, Greg. It was really wonderful to be up here to represent all the idiots who actually do serve in government. I really seriously want to thank everyone who organized this really important event. I am especially excited to be here at MIT, where so much of the future of cities is being crafted. And today's title is absolutely right. A disruption of mobility is underway and will only accelerate. Now, in some ways, as Nicholas alluded to, the disruption is occurring because we are at an important moment in urban history. A collision of massive urban growth and rapid technological innovation combining forces to transform cities. If you look back at the history of cities, look back over the last 200 years or so, there really have been 3 momentous technology-driven shifts that have profoundly affected cities. The first was the steam engine, which allowed us to move goods and people over long distances. The second was the introduction of the electric grid, which gave us lights, subways, elevators, that make density possible. And the third was the mass adoption of the automobile. I believe that we are just at the beginning of a 4th such urban revolution, an age of connectivity where new technologies are emerging to allow cities and citizens to tackle many of the biggest and most intractable challenges in new ways. Fundamentally, there are 6 big new technological advances that are foundational, are converging at this moment in time to make this possible. Mobile data networks that connect all of us. Digital identity and reputation systems that enable trust to be designed into cities. Location services that enable us to know where people and things are down to very, very small degrees. Ubiquitous sensors embedded in things and systems that allow us to act before things happen. Abundant computing power to handle much greater complexity. And new robotics and fabrication technologies, many of which rely on the other 5 elements that will unlock new ways of allowing what happens in the digital world to reach into and rearrange the physical world in useful ways. Together, and it's together in combination, these innovations are fueling companies like Airbnb, Uber, WeWork, and others, and just beginning to reshape our cities. Now, I know I don't need to tell this audience the things that this digital revolution can do for mobility, especially with the introduction of autonomous vehicles. Enabling sharing services, smoothing peak demand, improving the management and rider experience of transit systems, making travel time more productive, giving us safer, more complete streets, ultimately giving back the 20 to 30% of a typical city's land currently devoted to parking and excess roadways. But we have to remember that technological revolutions can be both good and bad for the city. Think back to the 3 previous shifts that I mentioned. The steam engine gave us railroads and factories, but polluted our cities terribly. Electricity enabled streetcars and subways, which allowed cities to grow. But the companies that built them became monopolies, and then, probably worse, regulated monopolies. Electricity also let us build taller buildings and provide more efficient housing, which led to the blocking of sunlight, retreating to artificial environments, and warehousing people in high-rises. Automobiles liberated individual travel, allowed greater metro growth, and broke the grip of streetcar companies, but gave us sprawl and nearly killed the central city. We are now only coming to grips with the enormous externalities of cars and the impact that they are having on our planet. So the key question is not whether mobility will be disrupted. It will. Or whether we should disrupt it. It'll happen whether we want to or not. But rather, will this disruptive era make our cities better or just place them in the thrall of a new set of technologies? This question is exactly the reason that I partnered with Larry Page and Google to launch Sidewalk Labs. Because history teaches us that the key to success is the combination of technological expertise and a deep understanding of what makes cities great. Cities are about interaction, about opportunity, creativity, sharing, and diversity. In other words, cities are about people. Whenever we improve the human experience, we improve the city. And whenever we forget to prioritize the human experience, we make it worse. The problems arise when either side, let's call them the technologist and the urbanist, forget that the city is about people, not technology. And our history is full of cautionary tales. We know that prior to 1910 or so, the American city street was a shared space where children played, cyclists biked, pedestrians walked. The automobile changed that, largely because the automobile industry convinced too many Americans that roads should be designed for cars. And then the car began to take over the city. This was in large part due to the fact that the automobile industry was not in the business of providing mobility, it was in the business of selling cars. But others were equally short-sighted. City officials failed to adjust streetcar franchises or allow fare hikes to enable transit to compete. In New York, the subway fare was a nickel for 45 years. And both transit companies and public officials prevented the development of jitney services, a new business model that might have put automotive technology in the service of shared, efficient urban travel. In some respects, the next wave of transportation technology offers the same forks in the road. But in other ways, this next wave is pretty different. Whereas the car took 30 years to hit mainstream adoption, the smartphone and its attendant technologies have taken 5 years, although clearly built upon a set of other investments. And whereas the government invested $500 billion in interstate highways over 30 years to catalyze a $1 trillion automotive industry, the private sector has now invested $500 billion in wireless networks with the potential to massively increase utilization of that automobile infrastructure. The result is that we now have technology that can unlock an abundance of transportation capacity that we never thought existed, giving us much greater freedom to design a future that we want. Do we want to enable much shorter commutes for both the rich and the poor to job centers across metro areas? We can do it today with much less capital investment via smartphone-based coordinated routing systems, real-time congestion pricing, and an open marketplace of carpooling and ride-sharing. Do we want to transform central business districts into pollution-free, pedestrian-friendly zones while providing shared mobility for many more? We can begin to do this in the not terribly distant future with commercially available fleets of shared autonomous EVs powered by Google and other companies. Of course, this future can't happen on its own. We need tractable policy that preserves society's scarce resources while empowering an incredibly vibrant marketplace that generates tremendous innovation. How do we do this? Our mission at Sidewalk Labs is to help both the technology entrepreneurs and urbanists, city officials, urban residents, and others find that right balance. We want to maintain the chaos that makes cities interesting while providing the coordination needed to make density a benefit rather than a burden. We hope to develop and nurture companies that will solve these questions in ways that help cities improve, not just fetishize one technology or take market share. Although we do intend to make money doing it. And make no mistake, when it comes to the future of cities, I am an enormous optimist. I've seen the difficulties cities face with technology firsthand. And I've also seen the virtuous cycle that occurs in cities when government and the private sector invest in growth. At Sidewalk, we're in our early days, but we know we have an important role to play, and one irony today makes that clear. Some of you may be aware that today, at the other end of the Northeast Corridor, the InnoZ Foundation is holding its annual policy forum. founded by the person who 100 years ago basically wrote the rules for how the automobile took over the city streets. InnoZ is a transportation think tank that mainly serves government officials. What's ironic is that their topic today is all about how autonomous vehicles could change the rules of the road, one of our key topics here. And most of the government officials are there, and we're all talking about the same thing. The fact that we're talking about the same thing is an indication that we are already at risk of repeating the mistakes of the past. So our first contribution at Sidewalk Labs is that one of my colleagues is in Washington today delivering basically the same message. And our message to both technologists and urbanists is the same. Remember that cities are fundamentally about people, and mobility exists to serve the residents, visitors, and businesses of our cities. That is the promise of this disruption in mobility, and that is therefore the task that we see. We need to ensure that government doesn't focus on defending existing institutions for their own sake, but only if and when they serve the public interest. We need to ensure that technologists do not prioritize their own technology or their own business over the legitimate needs of the public. We need to ensure that the new wave of mobility firms are in the business of providing access rather than mobility, because we know that the true measure of mobility is not how much people move or how many cars they buy, but whether their needs are met. Getting this right will require tremendous insight on the part of everybody, technologists, entrepreneurs, city officials, and urbanists everywhere. At Sidewalk Labs, we see huge opportunities for cities. We're tremendously enthusiastic about the innovations and disruptions that you are all working on, and we are here to discuss. And we are excited to help ensure that this next wave of disruption leads to better cities for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. Continuing our theme of public servants and whether or not they are idiots for having been so, I'd like to welcome, and continuing our bizarro theme where Negroponte argued for socialism, and now Deputy Secretary of Transportation Victor Mendez will talk about the far-ish future. So thank you, Deputy Secretary.
Well, thank you all very much. Good morning. A real pleasure for me to be here. And this is a great facility, Ryan, Nicholas. Thanks for doing this, developing this over the many years. I also do want to thank a lot of the organizing institutions, partners, and sponsors. I know how difficult it is to bring something like this together. And it's always important to have those folks behind you. So if it took a year and a half to get to this point, I know what it's like. I also do want to thank all the other speakers that are here with me. Some very interesting concepts that I've heard so far as we talk about disruption, mobility, and many other things that are important to all of us. Dan, I do totally agree with you. The issue of where we as individual citizens, we're human, the human experience, wherever you happen to live, it's important for all of us to ensure that we have the proper and positive human experience for all of us, and so I do agree with that. Now, one of the key themes is that changes happening in transportation present both challenges and, of course, very exciting opportunities. And this is more or less exactly what we found in our recent report that we issued actually early this year. It's called Beyond Traffic. And Nicholas, unlike the 10 years and 10 years and 10 years, we actually looked 30 years ahead. So I may not be around for the next 30 years when we look back and see what did USDOT find out. What we wanted to do was to take a look at what might happen over the next 10, 20 to 30 years when you look at transportation. So important for me to recognize that Beyond Traffic took a lot of effort. We did bring together a lot of stakeholders from the world that we worked within. And our Volpe Research Center was instrumental in bringing together a lot of these concepts and actually delivering on the report itself. So I do want to share some important points from Beyond Traffic with all of you. The top line, as we think about these issues the next day and a half, the top line on this is that by the year 2045, our population throughout the U.S. will grow by 70 million people. That's a lot of people we have to think about, and how do we deal with that? That means that 70 million more Americans will be competing for lane space on roads and entering train stations and airports. It also means that we're going to drive up demand for freight. We estimate that by the year 2045, freight will increase somewhere between 45 to 50%. And so when you think about population growing, freight increasing tremendously, the question, the challenge for all of us collectively is how do we deal with that? How do we absorb that? And when this growth occurs, there's another question that I think all of us are dealing with today, is where is this growth going to occur? Will it be dispersed throughout the country, or will it be concentrated in certain areas? The answer is that growth will occur largely, as has been mentioned already, in metro areas and cities, has been for many decades now, and will continue to be that way. These are areas where road congestion is already a big problem, and in a lot of cases, the roads really cannot be expanded anymore to accommodate, as all of you have heard, a lot more vehicles. And so the question for us, the challenge, is what do we do about that? And really, this is indicative of trends that we are observing that are happening throughout the entire world. So it's not just a U.S. phenomenon, it's really a worldwide phenomenon. There is a staggering statistic that MIT's Media Labs has noted, and that is that 90% of global population growth in the 21st century will again occur in cities. 90%, that's pretty amazing. So clearly, if we fail to disrupt conventional approaches to mobility ourselves, the trends that we have identified and that MIT has identified will disrupt themselves. And so something will happen. I think for all the smart people that are in this room, the challenge for us is to figure out how can we really lay out a plan and be able to manage that disruption. There are some obvious political challenges, as all of you are aware, that we in Washington, D.C., and then trickles out into the local areas. In Washington, D.C., we're working with Congress. President Obama, Secretary Fox, we've been working on transportation issues with Congress for a long time. And there's no question that we really need to increase our investments in public transportation. There is no question that we need better policies that put focus on public transportation, on freight movement, and growth altogether. But the challenges that we face will indeed require more than conventional solutions. And that's part of the reason why we put together and developed our Beyond Traffic report. We did this to inspire the best minds and leaders in tech and innovation to develop some big answers. We recognize that many of our solutions to our challenges will need to be developed outside of our department and really outside of government as well. And it's especially true when it comes to one of our most promising developments in technology, autonomous and connected vehicles. We like to refer to that as connected automation. Secretary and I have made it a priority to travel to the nation's tech hubs, to places where technology is being incubated. The Secretary actually recently visited Israel, and which has become one of these startup nations. And we've done this to make it clear that our department really is very eager to figure out how do we implement technology to really solve our issues that we see, the challenges. On that note, I do want to congratulate MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab for announcing a new $25 million research center to further the development of autonomous vehicle technologies. Connected vehicles have the potential to revolutionize the way we move on our roadways. They could actually reduce or even eliminate traffic jams that cost our country, on average, $125 billion per year and pollute our environment. It's estimated that each and every one of us that actually does drive, that we actually get stuck in traffic 40 hours every year. And when you think about that, extremely unproductive. But most importantly for DOT, connected vehicles have the potential to eliminate 80% of unimpaired traffic fatalities. Think about that. An incredible, when it comes to safety, there could be an incredible improvement in safety. And at USDOT, safety is our highest priority. Always has been, it always will be. So let me update you on some of our efforts, which I want to add are supported by our ITS Connected Cities program in our Volpe Center here in this area. We have taken steps to get connected and autonomous vehicle technology into use within the next few years. Not too long ago, Secretary Fox announced a rule speeding up the introduction of vehicle-to-vehicle technology and vehicle-to-infrastructure technology in all new automobiles. We're also investing in pilot programs around the country to demonstrate how the technology works. Just a few months ago, USDOT announced $42 million in grants for connected vehicle projects in 3 different cities. In Tampa, we're supporting a project that installs connected technologies on streetcars. In rural America, we're providing funding to programs that are looking at connected technologies and freight movement. And in New York City, we're supporting the largest demonstration of connected vehicle technology in the world. Midtown Manhattan and Brooklyn will have about 10,000 vehicles equipped with technology that enables cars to communicate with each other and make us move safer and more efficiently. So looking ahead, maximizing the benefits of emerging technology will be a defining element of smart cities. And as we experience more urbanization, there are other things we need to look at as well, like smart energy management, more walkable neighborhoods, and big data analytics. We're promoting the use of alternative fuels by joining a government-wide effort to provide charging stations for electric vehicles at our workplaces. And we're also looking at how projects can not only improve transportation, but to the point that Dan mentioned, how do we improve our communities? Very, very important as we look toward the future. Last month, for example, I was in Los Angeles to announce a $15 million Tiger grant that will turn a blighted area of unused railroad into 6 miles of bicycle and pedestrian paths that will connect low-income communities to jobs and opportunity. These are the kinds of initiatives and projects that will carry us into the future and keep our infrastructure modern and innovative. So I do want to stress that solving our infrastructure problems is really a collaborative effort. There is no one entity, one person. It can't be just government, or it can't be just the private sector. It has to be a collaborative effort for all of us to be able to deliver on solutions for the future. It takes synergy between government, industry, and academia to build the world's best transportation system. So we want to continue pushing the envelope, working with all of you collectively. And also in the spirit of working together, we would like to hear from you about your thoughts on our Beyond Traffic report. So if you have a few minutes, I'd ask you to please visit transportation.gov, where you can offer your thoughts in electronic form about the future of transportation. You can tell us what you think we may have missed, what did we forget, and did we get anything right in regard to that? The one thing we did bring to the table that we want to make sure people understand, Beyond Traffic was not about us providing answers. We have opinions, we have expert opinions and answers, but we want to hear from everybody because we know there are other answers beyond what we can envision within USDOT. So it's important for all of us to hear from you. And then finally, what I would like to make note of as I close out my remarks, as I mentioned, safety our highest priority at USDOT. I know a lot of us do drive, and for those of you that do own vehicles, I do want to close out by reminding all of you to please buckle up. We're always connected, we know that, but when you're driving, we're asking everybody to please put away your cell phones when you're driving. It's very important for all of us to remain safe. The other element that's very, very important for all of us, if you look at statistics in the last 3 to 4 years, when it comes to pedestrians and bicyclists, our fatalities and injuries have actually increased dramatically. And so I'm asking all of you, if you do drive, to please be on the lookout for pedestrians and for bicyclists and runners. I like to run, and I see my colleagues do funny things sometimes. So be on the lookout for them. So with that, I'm asking all of you to please join us on our safety mission at USDOT. We want to ensure that everybody stays safe out there. So with that, I do want to say once again, thanks for inviting us. Thanks for being here with us, and I look forward to our next session. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Secretary. Our final speaker of this opening plenary will be MIT's own Kent Larson, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion. Kent, please.
So I'd like to come at the future from about 2900 BC. This is a diagram of an early city, and actually there's a lot we can learn from that. It's very high density. It's about a kilometer in diameter. It was more or less the ultimate place of live, work, play in a compact urban area. It had a mass transit connection on the waterway to other areas. And for thousands of years, this was the model. You see this in literally hundreds of medieval towns, essentially all the same diagram. Paris, exactly the same diagram. And as cities like Paris and London and Vienna and New York City grew, you tended to have a series of these compact neighborhoods that became networked together, but each retained a clear identity, and each was about a 20-minute walk. It's very interesting. Paris is a good example of the kind of amenities that are available literally within a 2 or 3-minute walk from every part of the city. The cafes, the shops, the physicians, the pharmacies. This is not how we plan cities today, and in fact, most cities have become very dysfunctional. About 1880, we had trolley networks that extended the city out along corridors, and that held for about 40 years. In the 1920s, cars took over, and everything went to hell, basically. We started to design for machines. Even here in Boston, the central artery cut this amazing swath through the city. We've since taken this down. Of course, we replaced it with 4 lanes of traffic and a traffic island. So this is the pattern that is really the predominant model here in the US. This low-density sprawl started in LA. In China, you have high-density sprawl, but it's the same pattern, separated functions. The idea is let everyone buy a car, connect everything by a roadway, put parking at each destination, and this is what you end up with. This could be Sao Paulo or Mumbai. This happens to be Beijing. On a good day, you see green and yellow, no red on the sign. So this is the experience of cities that we find. Beijing has just amazing pollution. About half of it comes from automobile. There are 3 big trends that all have been mentioned earlier. The sharing economy, as described in this Economist article. Profound change, particularly for the millennials. Millennials are not buying cars and houses. These are self-respecting millennials, as Nicholas mentioned, who want to live in the city. And this is an article from a couple of weeks ago, 6 big European cities with plans to go car-free. I mean, cars are literally killing cities, and the most innovative are recognizing this, and they're finding alternatives to that. So what are those alternatives? We can start with the new systems. This is a diagram that shows the kind of alternative mobility modes that we think are important. The most important by far is walking in the upper left. Shared bikes, on-demand shuttles. We've been prototyping here at the Media Lab alternatives like electric hub motor, green wheel, convert conventional bikes to electric bikes, little 3-wheelers, a folding robo-scooter, the city car. I'll talk about a couple of these. Some years ago, we did this little folding city car, robot wheels, get rid of gasoline-powered motors and drivetrain, et cetera. You allow it to fold, front egress, drive-by-wire. This was an interesting project for the time. We built a full-scale prototype. We launched it at EU headquarters. But we came to realize that this was sort of an interim step. In fact, this is already, I think, an obsolete idea. First of all, most trips within the city are one person, so we thought a little folding bike-like vehicle that could be integrated with bike sharing was a much better idea. And then we realized that probably wasn't the optimal idea, because I think the future when it comes to mechanized mobility combines these three elements. It combines autonomy, vehicle sharing, electrification. If you replace sharing with private ownership, I think it kills cities, frankly, and that's something we could talk about. We're looking now at a little lightweight, bike-like autonomous vehicle that moves people and goods, and we're prototyping that now in our lab. This is the chassis with its little sister, this little platform that is used for mapping the bike paths. This is a legal bike lane vehicle in the European Union. So this is the prototype you can see downstairs in our lab, which we shot a couple of weekends ago out in the city. So it's bike-like, not car-like. It uses extremely low-cost autonomy, maybe $2,000 or $3,000 versus expensive LiDAR systems that are used for highway vehicles. It's a legal bike lane vehicle. It's shared use, and it moves both people and goods. So we hope to continue that project. It's essential, though, to think beyond just the vehicles. I think we have to think about what creates a high-functioning community where you don't need mechanized mobility. These are the cities in the US where housing is unaffordable for those millennials that would like to move back to the city, basically to those cities that are the most innovative. So I think housing is actually tightly coupled to mobility systems if you're thinking about cities. So in the interest of making housing more affordable to millennials so they can live and work in the central cities, we had this little project called the City Home. The goal of this was to take a very small footprint and allow it to function as if it was 3 times bigger. So in this case, it converts from a bedroom with a queen-size bed to a fully functional office to a dining space for 6 people, a living room for 8 people. Most of those young people, if they live right in the city, they will not own cars. This is Kendall Square. Everything in red is a parking lot or a parking deck. It's an incredible waste of extremely valuable urban space in an area with some of the most valuable land in the country. This is now how the private automobile system operates. You can see here number of vehicles, parking time, user time. If you move towards shared autonomous vehicles, you can provide mobility with about 1/3 the vehicles, essentially get rid of all parking. And all those parking spaces, as this little study shows, could be replaced with higher functioning uses, such as housing. So those 45 cars could actually provide housing at the existing building heights in Cambridge for 528 people, if we look at micro units. Urban simulation is an area that we're working on, particularly to model compact high-performance districts. We come to realize that the technology innovation, the system innovation is not enough. We actually have to model it, and we have to actually convince the community that these are good ideas. So down in our lab, you can see our Cityscope project, which is really an augmented reality system where we project information onto a physical model and can do all kinds of simulation. We can look at, for example, in Kendall Square, where is the money? We're very interested in what enables entrepreneurship and innovation. That bright yellow area there is the Cambridge Innovation Center with about 350 startups, so not surprisingly, that's where all the money is focused. Look at where young people are active. So we can display geolocated tweets. Media Lab lights up when you send a tweet with hashtag Cityscope. You can look at the areas of dense Twitter activity, and that's a pretty reasonable proxy for where young people are active. We've modeled traffic as a function of the three things we care about: density, proximity, and diversity. This was a little platform we developed for a workshop in Toronto, where the red bricks are residential, the blue are commercial, the orange are parking. On the right, you see the mix of live and work. The green is the demand for parking. So as you begin to experiment, and we're designing this so lay people can actually experiment, community groups can experiment, and with a real evidence-based process, get a sense of what the possibilities are. So in this case, once you get to a nice balance of live-work, you can reduce the demand for parking because the probability that somebody will walk to and from work goes up. You can increase the density without having the negatives that typically come with it, like traffic congestion, and you can essentially get rid of all the parking. A little more sophisticated algorithm for a workshop in Riyadh, where we were looking at 3 different parameters: walkability, daylighting, and energy performance. We worked with the Riyadh Development Authority. In this workshop, 20 planners were divided into 4 teams of 5. They had 1 hour to use this platform and design the city. And you see, as they move these components, which are databases that describe the number of people that live and work in each of those spaces, you get a real-time response as to any of the 3 visualizations that we're working on. Now, drilling down into that, we now have a table that's based on the Barcelona grid, although you could rapidly turn it into the Manhattan grid. And here we're looking at more fine-grained functionality, and can then model its impact on traffic and other parameters. What we're particularly interested in is modeling the interaction of people within a compact urban district, because we think if you can have people with diverse experiences sharing ideas in a compact, vibrant district, then that increases the potential for creative activity, which leads to entrepreneurship, which leads to GDP and all kinds of good things. So in this case, we modeled millennials in blue. In this case, they're in the upper part of that district, isolated, because that's where they can afford housing. In reality, they're probably off the model in the suburbs of East Kendall Square, because no millennials can afford to live in Kendall Square. The mid-career professionals are modeled in yellow, and the senior executives in red. So with this agent-based simulation system, you can get to that mix of functionality, the kind of density and diversity that would draw people together with diverse experiences, and we can begin to model those creative exchanges, and I think have the potential to even put a number on the innovation potential of a district. So for us, this is really quite exciting work. And working with our colleagues in the city of Boston, they, I think, are very good. They have a good sense of what is needed. You know, walkable communities, bike lanes, they're looking at autonomous vehicles and all kinds of new mobility systems. For them, the biggest impediment is not what to do, but how to get the community to buy into these ideas. So the community engagement process is so critical, which is why we're building these new types of tools that allow for, in effect, a democratization of urban planning, make them accessible to people beyond just the usual suspects like the planning community. We have a project in Hamburg right now, which is very exciting to us. Had a meeting last week with the mayor. This article in the Smithsonian, Hamburg plans to become car-free by 2034. He said to me that's overstated a little bit. He only wants 40% of the city to be car-free by 2034. But this is actually a serious goal. We're modeling this couple of districts within the city, looking at all these parameters. Probably the most important parameter that we're looking at would be the alternative mobility systems. This is the city-scope model that we've built of the Rothenburg-Sort district, which is slated to be an innovation district and a living laboratory to experiment with all kinds of ideas. And just an example of a project that we just completed here in Boston, where there are plans that have been proposed to put in a network of bus rapid transit systems. There are different ideas, different alternatives for the station design and the routing, et cetera. So we developed 3 different platforms that were located in a community center in Dudley Square, where we could model the impact of these bus rapid transit systems at the regional scale, the community scale, and the street scale. Each of these are interactive systems that allow people from the community, in this case at the regional scale, to see the impact on them as an individual if each of these systems were put into place. They could see the impact at the scale of their neighborhood, that roughly 1 kilometer area. And as they look at alternatives, get real-time feedback with respect to the data, its impact on traffic, speed of traffic, bicycle flows, energy cost, et cetera. And then we had a station to look at the alternatives at the level of the street. So this little video just shows people from the community interacting with it. That's at the regional scale. By the way, she's one of the leaders of that community. What we found, you don't have to get everybody to come to these workshops. You just need to find the leadership, because they have, in many cases, hundreds of followers that look to them for their approval of these systems. So the regional scale, the station scale, it's all pretty interesting. And this is a work in progress. I think figuring out how to use these very powerful algorithms, but put them together in a way so they're accessible to lay people, I think is a really interesting challenge. And so just echoing the message of the previous speakers, let's remember that cities are for people, they're not for machines. Probably the greatest challenge of our era, I believe, is to deal with the impact of extreme urbanization. The planet is rapidly urbanizing. It's a societal imperative that we get this right, and I'm delighted that we're able to have this discussion over these couple of days. Thank you.
Well, Kent, don't wander off too far. Gentlemen, if you could come back on stage, take some seats coming from this end. I'll take a seat here. Well, thank you each so much for your great talks. I guess I want to start in, considering this is our opening plenary, and considering this will really set the tone for the rest of the conference, before we get into some of the specifics that you talked about, I want to take a step back and ask a philosophical question, which is, ultimately, what are we disrupting mobility for? I want to ask each of you, what is your highest aim in disrupting mobility? Because depending on what your aim is, of course, it will lead us to different spatial outcomes and mobility outcomes. So for example, if it's climate change, if we need a crash course to basically reduce carbon emissions, then we shouldn't be talking about autonomous cars at all, perhaps. We should be talking about crash courses and mass transit and making it more autonomous, making it more electric, figuring out ways to expand that. Is it livability? I mean, Dan, you talk often about the virtuous circle of New York, really increasing the livability of the city, which then attracted population and wealth. So are we favoring, the livability aspect of that and accessibility in the best neighborhoods? Or is it, economic justice in a way? Should we be trying to basically expand service and disrupting mobility in some of the poorest neighborhoods? My colleagues at NYU, for example, a few of which are here, did a great study showing that, essentially the neighborhoods in New York with the highest incomes also are the most walkable, have the best transit, and thus the highest accessibility to jobs. And in neighborhoods like mine in Queens, we have the highest percentage of automotive ownership, and also, some of the poorest households. So I'm curious, each of you, if you could talk a bit about really sort of, is there a North Star in all of this that we should be aiming for, or at least in your minds, before we get into discussions more about millennials and autonomous cars and all the great words out here? Anyone? Dan,
I'm happy to go. I mean, you said it. I think everything is about quality of life, right? And there's no one definition of quality of life, but there's certainly a set of attributes that we can ascribe to quality of life: cost, convenience, health, safety, green, environmental characteristics, opportunities, fairness. All those are elements of quality of life. And that's ultimately what, certainly as a policymaker, and I would hope as a provider of technology, we're all actually striving for.
Well, I've been to a lot of conferences related to cities recently, and they tend to have titles like smart city, low carbon city, resilient city, eco city, et cetera, et cetera. And I think coming at it in that more limited, focused way is not productive. When you talk to the mayors, and we've had an opportunity to talk to quite a few, there are three things that keep coming up. One is entrepreneurship, which is about jobs and GDP. They all care about that. And second is, of course, quality of life and livability. Everybody cares about that. And third, probably it's in this order, is how efficiently they use resources. I think you could probably bring all that together in quality of life, but it really is about jobs and performance and livability.
Let me add to the equation here. The things we have been looking at in terms of high priority has been safety, technology, and what we call ladders of opportunity. So I think the first two, we all have talked about that. The one thing that's really very important for all of us is to be able to connect people to opportunity. That's jobs, healthcare, education, on and on. And making those smart investment decisions isn't going to happen if we continue doing things the way we used to do them in the past. So, I come from a background where, hey, my parents didn't have 4 homes. We rented for the longest time. So we're looking for ways to utilize transportation as a means to raise people to a higher level when it comes to economic mobility. And that's something that's very near and dear to the Secretary's heart, to a lot of us. We're looking at trying to figure out how do we make those decisions when you're actually investing to help people actually rise in the economic scale.
Great. Nick, any thoughts on this?
Well, I think the quality of life is obviously the goal, but what I would hope people would then also say for everybody. In other words, that it is universal. And I get a little nervous when I hear education as an opportunity. It's a right, it's not an opportunity. And healthcare is, and my point before was, and I was brought up in a family where civil service was the highest calling. And my father made that very clear. My older brother, whom you may know, by name at least, has been a civil servant all his life. I went to be a professor. Our younger brothers are artists. Maybe that's more self-serving, but there was in the world, it was a Kennedy-esque view of the world, that you were privileged and it was your job to make the world a better place. And I believe that was a very fortunate position. And from that, I think that my interests are to make sure that everybody has that it's the quality of life but for all.
Great. Well, another big picture question, I guess, Dan, I was hoping you could take this one a bit because I thought it was interesting. So far we're all Americans on this panel. I mean, we're discussing mostly in American context. There were some discussions of Europe in here, but I mean, obviously the growth in mega urbanization is going to happen in the global South, and so I'm particularly curious about how these ideas are going to play out in the global South, and when anybody has any ideas on this. I mean, what does this mean for Manila? What does this mean for Sao Paulo? I think it was Florian who mentioned it at dinner last night. The mayor of Sao Paulo is very interested in expanding transit access, but doesn't care about cars, isn't banning them, but is not really investing any effort in that, is not really interested in any solutions that are built based around cars. So I'm curious how this applies. And Dan, I picked you on this because you mentioned the policy mistake we made in banning jitneys. I mean, New York has the thriving dollar van culture, which is semi-regulated here, but on its own would be one of the largest transportation networks in America. So I'm curious, in your time as mayor and your interest in Sidewalk, do we need to network together informal transit? Is that one opportunity?
I think that's a huge opportunity, actually. I mean, if you look at examples in Nairobi, for example, where they've developed these almost informal networks of jitneys or shared vehicles, it's pretty remarkable how efficient and how cost-effective it actually is. Now, that's a low-tech, although aided by smartphones, right, and geolocational services, way of actually dramatically enhancing the efficiency of the transit system. Everything we're talking about, everything I'm sure we'll talk about over the course of today and tomorrow, really applies both in the developed world and the developing world. In some cases, it's easier depending on governmental structures, depending on what's there. I mean, look at India and China trying to build all these new cities. You have an enormous opportunity to really rethink on an integrated basis a whole set of technologies and create a platform for city to evolve over time and be actually more efficient, more environmentally friendly, more all the other objectives that we talked about. So yeah, I think these things can apply obviously in every place, but just the conditions are always going to be different because the politics, the land use, the existing conditions are always different too.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I'm going to open this up to questions from the audience in a moment because I know you have better questions than I do. But I have a group question for the other three gentlemen up here, which is, I think the most surprising part of our morning plenary, Nick, was your real call for more active planning and the more role of government in this. And I'm curious how planning can change and will change in the age of disruptive mobility of this. You know, because of course in America the mantra is the government cannot innovate, that really it should step back, but obviously there's of course a role for setting the playing field. I mean, I was thinking, Victor, in this case, you know, that for example, standards in terms of vehicle interoperability on autonomous vehicles at high speeds are of course not fully developed yet. And so I'm curious what more role the government can play in actually standard setting and really sort of defining this, and also the role of, you know, how governance and planning will evolve. Kent, I think your sort of simulations, your experiments have sort of talked about that, about how we can actually sort of change the community involvement process where citizens can become planners in this and thinking about this. So I don't know, there's a question in there somewhere, but I was hoping each of you could talk in turn about really how we can evolve governance to be faster, more responsive, more inclusive, so it can actually keep up with this technological disruption from the private sector.
Let me give it a try here. On the regulatory front, which is our vehicle to be able to establish standards, and of course we have to work with the industry to make sure that happens. It is a cumbersome process. You know, that's the process that we have. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. It's a difficult process at best. But I think what we also need is to have industry come to the table to provide us with answers. You know, oftentimes because there is an economic advantage, competitive advantage to not give us all the information, some of that is withheld. So I think it's really something that's of mutual interest to all of us to help benefit the society in general. So we need some support in that arena. The other thing that I would say on the planning front, I came from Phoenix, Arizona. For years we debated public transportation, light rail. We wanted to implement light rail, and everybody said it could not happen. And guess what? It has happened, very successful. But I think part of the planning process is bringing people to the table and then actually delivering and showing people, once you have, for example, light rail available, all of a sudden people realize, hey, this is a good system to have, and I'll use it. But without having the reality in front of you, it's very difficult. You can plan and plan and plan and bring in all the civic leaders and business leaders, but until you feel it, you can touch and feel something, that's when it makes a difference.
Yeah, Dan,
I was going to say, well, go ahead, and I'll go afterwards. But
well, I was just going to say that, the idea that you can do an urban plan today that will work in 20 or 30 years is absurd. And I think the conventional approach to urban planning is frankly brain dead now. But without some creative involvement by government, you have chaos. And so I think we will all be thinking about the implications of that over the next few years. There are a lot of people beginning to think about algorithmic zoning and performance-based zoning and having very clear rules in place, but that are agile enough to adapt to new technologies and new economic conditions. How that plays out exactly, I'm not sure, but I think it's a fabulous area of research.
I was just going to say, I'm actually a huge optimist about government, a big believer in government and the capacity of government to actually plan with the input from the public. I mean, we have in the audience today, I think one of the people who's had the single biggest impact on mobility in certainly American cities in recent times, Jeanette Sadiq-Khan, who by force of will largely instituted bike share, pedestrian plazas, bus rapid transit, a whole set of other innovations. But even on a bigger scale, to respond to your comment, look, in New York last month, I attended the opening of the number 7 subway line. It was the first subway line extension in New York in 25 years, and around it was built this entire plan for the west side of Manhattan into what had been sort of a wasteland on the west side of Manhattan. And key to the whole thing was mobility, extending the subway into the area. And what was remarkable is we rezoned around it. We rezoned around it for a downtown, essentially a mixed-use downtown, about 50% the size of downtown Boston. And, thinking ahead 25, 30, 50 years, and it's all happening. And this $300 million equity investment the city made is producing net tax real estate revenues to the city of $30 billion, which then gets used to produce the kinds of investments in quality of life that make a city work. So, sometimes government doesn't work well. Sometimes government's corrupt. Sometimes government's stupid. Absolutely true. But doesn't mean we shouldn't aspire for a higher standard. And I really believe that we are capable, both the public working with the private sector, of producing really extraordinary things. And at this moment in time, we have the greatest opportunity, I think, in the last almost 100 years.
No. Nick, my favorite part of your talk, before I open up to the audience, is that when you said that capitalism is not democracy. And the first thing I thought when you said that was, it is when it's lobbying. And of course,
when it's what?
When it's lobbying. And of course, arguably Uber's greatest innovation is not, in fact, the algorithmic models, as you pointed out, but Uber's incredible strategy of lobbying, astroturfing, basically breaking in and fracking up government opposition to it as a way to get into these cities. And I guess I'm curious your thoughts on the landscape about this, because in Uber's case, it's interesting because Travis Kalanick is an Ayn Rand reader and obviously believes in free markets, but has developed a very sophisticated legal approach to subverting regulation before it can sort of form opposition to him. So I'm curious, do you think that's sort of a perversion of technological disruption and progress? I don't know. I'm curious your thoughts as you survey the legal landscape in that case.
Excuse me for not answering your question directly, because I don't care about what Uber lobbies for and how it works.
All right.
But I do care. I do deeply care about the assumption that government is always knuckleheaded. And I agree with you completely. And when people tell me, well, government can't do anything, I don't want to pay my taxes, I don't want them to do this, the private sector should do it, we should privatize everything. I said, have you been on a Swiss train recently?
And there they vote on everything, too.
Right, but that's even a different kind of a referendum government, which I don't particularly believe in either, but it's the fact that we are allergic to government doing things is actually an American phenomenon. Mm-hmm. It does not exist so much in Europe. You said we were all Americans. I, by the way, am a card-carrying European. I have a European passport, and I live there, used to live there half the year. They don't think that way. People in Northern Europe don't wake up in the morning with the assumption that government is knuckleheaded and what can we do to get around it this time. And I think that's a very important change that one should keep in mind. Mm-hmm. And when I was saying before, and maybe I said it wrong, we don't get our young to aspire to be part of it. And I wish we would, because it's a very important part. And yes, you can duck in and duck out and be there, but maybe as a career, we've got to get our smartest young people and not tell them, oh, go start another little startup company and you can do this. And there's this brain drain of all these little startup companies doing silly little apps and so on, and it's much more fun and so et cetera. But we've had at the Media Lab, and forgive my numbers because they may not be totally accurate, but you get the point. We graduate about 50 people a year, and I could count on half of those people going off to work on big, hard, long-term problems, whether it's technical like fusion or it's humanitarian like eliminating poverty. Half the people work. Mm. That's not true anymore. So many of them are starting little companies here, little companies there. It's probably 1 out of 50. There's a brain drain. Our society is losing people in the population of working on long, hard-term problems, which also would include civically funded thing, I mean, there are many aspects to it.
You know, with respect to optimism, I'm very optimistic about the possibilities for cities. I think the mayors, by and large, are amazingly creative. The staff people that are working with the mayors are. As you get up to state and federal governments, you begin to lose some of that creativity. But I think the real exciting developments, I think, are happening at the scale of the city. In Europe, cities, the mayors have more power, they have more resources, they can do bigger things. In this country, we're skewed more towards rural and suburban values, so the mayors don't have quite the same possibilities. But I think a lot of the innovations will take place in these, particularly in the northern European cities, because of the political.
I might add that most mayors in this country do not view being mayor as a stepping stone to become senator or to become thing. Many people will be mayors for a significant period of time to be the mayor. It's to running that city. It's a very different kind of civil office.
They're probably incapable of moving up just because they're successful mayors.
Well, there's always the private sector, as Dan has proved. We have time for 2 questions in this because time flies, and Nick may not answer them either. But we're going to do 2 questions. So we're going to get one. Let's see. All right, Florian, because Florian's a co-organizer, so he can have one, and then we'll go to one in the back.
Yes, and thank you for giving me the opportunity. I just wanted to pick up on the first question that you asked, because I really felt that none of you really answered that question. And I think I wanted to return to that, because I think without a North Star, we will not get to solve this problem. And I think, Nicholas, I very much agree with many of the things that you say, but I think that if we do look at where we are and how mobility systems evolved to date, then we cannot deny that this has something to do with a petrochemical industrial complex, that this is fundamentally poisoning our planet, not just in terms of CO2, and that if we really want to have all those things, whether it's entrepreneurship or quality of life or all these wonderful things that politicians say, these somewhat wishy-washy things, I mean, what is quality of life? So I do want to return the question back to you guys and say, don't we have to think much more radically about how we decarbonize? And decarbonizing is not just getting rid of carbon, it's getting rid of all these other poisons that we're dumping onto the environment. If we continue doing that, we won't have any jobs or any health or any quality of life. So perhaps another attempt to ask you to focus on that a little bit more?
I'll take it, but I completely disagree with your notion that quality of life is like some wishy-washy concept. You tell me that the average American spends $9,000 a year on a car. If you can reduce that to $2,000 to $3,000, that isn't a dramatic impact on the lives of virtually everybody in this country when we have too many people struggling with simply making ends meet. So cost really does matter. So does convenience, because the way we live our lives is a function of how much time we have to spend on the things and the people that we truly love. That's not wishy-washy. That is real. Now, I'm not in any way minimizing the importance of the environment, and I believe shared, particularly electronic vehicle mobility systems, can have a massive impact on the environment, maybe more than almost anything in many places. In cities, actually, it's much more about buildings than it is about cars. But at the end of the day, that's an equally important value, but you can't just limit it to one, because that's not the way people want to live their lives. That's not what businesses are all about. Instead, what it is, it's a complex set of factors that go into making people have a higher degree of happiness. That's what it's all about.
Anyone else?
We'll go back. I agree completely, except that my solution would be not to make the $10,000 car cost $2. It would be to make the $10,000 car cost $20 and not emit any carbon.
Just to clarify, I meant the cost of transportation
for
the individual.
No, but I would see I'm happy to let the cost go up.
Yeah, me too.
I own an electric car and generate 150% of the electricity I need on an annual basis. And so I'm kind of living what I'm preaching. And now, if you can't afford that, how do you make that affordable? And so, yes, I would but quality of life is what it's about. And if you put global warming at the top of yours, which I do too, by the way, then fine. But that's all part of the same package.
Yeah, let me just add a little bit to that. And going back to the notion of mayors, how mayors fundamentally, they deal with day-to-day issues. You go up the chain, you're beginning, I'm at the federal government now, you begin thinking more in terms of what I would say are theoretical solutions. But the reality of what happens each and every day and how you deal with it versus what you're looking to accomplish in the next 5, 10, 20 years, you have to deal with those issues. And it's not as easy as prioritizing, is it climate change, is it quality of life? It's really, a mayor has to deal, and like us, once I put away my suit, I live in a community. And those are the things that we have to deal with day in and day out. Plus, you have to think about the future. So it's not a matter of just prioritizing one over the other. It's dealing with reality today as well. And so, it's very complex, as
Other
we all
questions?
know.
Sorry to cut you off. Anyone in the back before I get there? All right, well, we have a couple questions in the front. The gentleman in glasses there in the middle. Microphone's coming.
Oh, great. Thanks. I'm Paul Salama. I'm an urban planner in New York City. My question, I guess, is mostly directed at Dan, but also bringing in the Uber lens. We talk about the technologists and the people who have a deep understanding of urbanism. How do we get to that balance point of the city center that is car-free versus the Uber, a new form of Uber that is doing the conspiracy around the trolleys?
Yes, the new version of General Motors, you mean, in LA in the 1920s. Yes. Anyone?
So I'm not 100% sure I understood the question. How do we get there in a place like New York? We hopefully encourage lots of competition. We create infrastructure that more than one company can take advantage of. We don't favor through a regulatory process one specific company or one specific approach. But there's no simple answer to any of this. We have to kind of battle it out through the political process. Uber is a really interesting example, right? And you're seeing it play out in New York now, where there's the mayor is sort of battling with Uber. In reality, what Uber did was not just creative lobbying. What Uber really did was capitalize on a regulatory flaw. And the regulatory flaw was to give taxi cabs and taxi cab fleets a monopoly on street hails. Well, and they defended that monopoly under, incredibly forcefully. Well, what ended up happening is through the technology, that regulatory advantage actually got arbitraged away, right? Because now you don't need the time, the time advantage of a street hail is essentially gone. And so what that now forces us to do is confront sort of a new regime, and we battle that through both the public market, and so the market for ideas, and private market technologies, and eventually we arrive, hopefully, at some sort of equilibrium that respects free competition, but at the same time helps to manage things, because without it, there's chaos.
Yeah. And I just want to add, if your goal is to develop a car-free central city, you can't do that without focusing on housing. People have to be able to live and work in a compact, walkable community. You can't rely on market forces to do that, because that will produce luxury housing. You need to have diverse housing. So in effect, I think you need a socialist housing policy to get rid of cars in central cities, maybe counterintuitively.
Time for one last question. I want to get someone on this side of the room. So that gentleman there, I believe.
My name is Peter Marks. I'm with the City of Los Angeles. And a lot of us, I'm going to ask a question, even though the previous speaker was from New York and I'm from another big city and so on. But I'm curious as to your thoughts about how this applies to the smaller cities. There are 25,000 cities across the country, and a lot of us are really focused on issues around big cities like Boston and so on. I'd love to see what your thoughts are about the evolution of smaller cities in the face of disrupted mobility.
Great question. Anyone want to take this? I would say my addition to this is it seems that there appears to be a sort of lower limit for ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft in which to work. I believe, if I recall correctly, Uber was having difficulty in cities smaller than 100,000 people because a critical mass was absent. So I'm curious, what do we do with the rural, not just rural America, but suburban America and small city America?
Look, I think that the solutions will rely on similar technologies, but will be different. The whole question of transportation demand management and pooling of people into more efficient, less car-intensive arrangements to get them to work or to get them to other places, I think applies on sort of either the fringes of big cities or in smaller or medium-sized cities where you certainly don't have the capability for mass transit and where the cost of the car typically, particularly if they're moving from longer distances to work, is significant. So I said, the solution will be different. The underlying technologies, I think, will produce potentially equally interesting results.
I spent some time with Andy Burke, the mayor of Chattanooga, Tennessee, and he emphasized that the same thing was happening in Chattanooga that you see in Boston, where property values in the city are going up. Young people want to move to the city. Property values in the suburbs are not improving, or from the recession. They're putting in bike lanes. They're putting in the infrastructure that allows for all the amenities that millennials want. And this is a small city in a red state.
Yeah, let me add to that. The work that we've been doing at the federal level, it's very true. You may have various size cities or categories, but I think mayors generally are tending to look at similar solutions. It's just at a different scale, but I think the concepts, certainly you want to improve quality of life. How do you make things better for their citizens? And the investments are, how do you target the investments to get to those policy issues that they want to accomplish? So from my standpoint, size really doesn't count. I mean, it does in reality, but I think the way people are looking toward the future, it's very similar.
Great. All right, well, with that, I believe we're out of time. Can I get a round of applause for our panelists? We're going to adjourn now for a coffee break, and if I leave you with one closing thought for this, it was a great browser extension which will translate the word millennial to snake people. So I highly recommend it. So when you can start making generalizations about millennials, just think of the snake people and what they want out of the city. So thank you. See you at 11.